At the time, I was 17 and living in Denver. It was during the summer and took place in my parents' cabin in rural Colorado, outside of Estes Park, in a wooded area with the nearest people being 7 miles north. It was summer, and as a teenager that has nothing to do, my mom encouraged me to drive out to our underused cabin in rural Colorado. Before I left, my girlfriend texted that she wanted to come over to my house, so I invited her to the summer home. She planned to leave before night. The drive to Denver from the house is not short, but that night she would not be doing so. We brought 2 cars, her, a minivan, me, a Ram. We spent a time walking outside or watching TV and such. By the time 6 p.m. rolled around, I decided to stay the night, and my girlfriend was going to leave in a few minutes, so I told her, "You can leave whenever. But right now, I'm going to grab pillows from my truck." The cars had to be parked a quarter-mile up from the house, so I began my walk. Get to the car, grab my pillows, walk back, and see my girlfriend absolutely distraught. She was walking for the door a minute after I left to catch up to me when at the door she told me I heard a light scratch. Then apparently she heard in my voice, "Hey, open the door and let me in." Luckily, my girlfriend is very paranoid and decided to look through a window to see me walking down the road oblivious and nobody at the door. I am confident that neither of us were under the influence and we were both sober. But that is only the first of 2 encounters. Both of us were freaked out by this, so we closed windows and doors and slept through the night completely fine. She left quickly at around 8, and I was left alone. I decided to stay because I was actually enjoying the freedom of being alone until it came to an end when I returned to the cabin. After entering, I crossed the large room to sit on the couch when I shit you not, I hear my girlfriend at the door, sounding distraught, saying, "Open the door. Oh, please, please open the damn door," accompanied with scraping sound on the concrete path. I called out and said, "What the hell is going on?" I hear a reply in my own voice, "Open the door, don't be a fool." I locked myself in the bathroom and called my dad to come over. I stayed in the bathroom until he got to the cabin and I told him everything. I don't know if he believed me, but the next day we left immediately. It all began innocently enough. I was in need of a new couch and turned to Craigslist to find a good deal. Scrolling through the listings, I stumbled upon a post that seemed too good to be true, a nearly brand new leather sofa being sold for a fraction of its original price. The seller, going by the name John, had listed his contact details and claimed the couch was available for immediate pickup. Intrigued, I sent him a message, and within minutes he responded. We arranged to meet at his remote cabin in the woods the following Saturday. As I drove out to the cabin, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The location was isolated, far from any semblance of civilization. The GPS guided me down winding dirt roads, and I had to wonder if I had made a mistake. The cabin finally came into view, nestled among the trees. It was old and weathered, with a dilapidated porch that seemed on the verge of collapsing. I parked my car and approached the front door, my heart pounding. John greeted me with a smile that seemed forced, his eyes darting nervously. He led me inside, and I couldn't help but notice the odd smell that hung in the air, a sickly sweet, metallic odor that made my stomach churn. The couch itself appeared as advertised, a luxurious leather behemoth in pristine condition. I hesitated for a moment, taking in the room's unsettling decor, dark, crimson walls adorned with strange symbols and shelves filled with macabre trinkets. I asked John about the smell, trying to appear casual. He dismissed it as an issue with the plumbing, assuring me it was nothing to worry about. Eager to leave, I decided to make the purchase. As we finalized the transaction, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of the room, a large, ornate mirror. My reflection looked back at me, but it was distorted, as if my features were shifting and warping before my eyes. I quickly turned away, attributing it to the strange surroundings. Carrying the couch to my truck, I felt an oppressive weight settle over me. John's behavior and the cabin's atmosphere had set me on edge, and I couldn't wait to get away. That night, as I arranged the couch in my living room, a sense of dread washed over me. The strange smell that had permeated John's cabin lingered on the leather. I decided to give it a thorough cleaning, but as I lifted the cushions, I discovered something that chilled me to the bone. Hidden beneath the cushions were a horrifying sight, a grisly collection of human body parts, neatly organized and wrapped in plastic. Shock and revulsion coursed through me as I realized the couch was a grotesque repository of unspeakable horrors. I immediately called the police, my voice trembling as I reported the gruesome discovery. They arrived at my home swiftly, their faces a mix of disbelief and horror as they examined the macabre contents of the couch. The investigation that followed was intense, but despite their best efforts, the authorities could find no trace of John. Weeks turned into months, and the case remained unsolved. The fear that he might resurface and seek retribution haunted my every waking moment. I installed security cameras, changed my locks, and even considered moving, but the unease stayed with me. Then, one evening as I sat in my living room, a chilling realization washed over me. The distorted reflection I had seen in the mirror at John's cabin had not been a trick of the light. It had been a warning, a glimpse into the twisted mind of a killer who had hidden in plain sight. I knew then that I could never truly escape the horror that John had brought into my life. He remained at large, a malevolent presence lurking in the shadows, biding his time. As the nights grew longer, I began to notice unsettling signs that made my skin crawl. Shadows danced ominously outside my windows, and I would sometimes wake to the sensation of being watched. It was as though John, the elusive killer, was taunting me, letting me know that he was closer than I ever dared to imagine. I understood that my nightmare was far from over. It was a desperate time in my life. I needed a place to stay, and my limited budget led me to explore Craigslist for room rentals. That's where I stumbled upon an ad for a room that promised affordability and convenience. The catch: my landlord would be a peculiar man named Victor, who had an unusual hobby: crafting dolls. I scheduled a viewing and arrived at the address on a chilly evening. The house stood on the outskirts of town, a dilapidated structure with an eerie air about it. Victor greeted me with a wide, unsettling smile, his eyes flickering with a strange intensity. The smell of disinfectant masked something far more sinister. The room itself was modest but adequate. Victor assured me it was a steal, considering the current housing market. I couldn't argue with that, and my desperation overrode my unease. I agreed to move in the following week. The first few days were uneventful, and I settled into my new life, focusing on work and keeping to myself. Victor, however, seemed fixated on his peculiar hobby. The house was littered with doll parts, limbs, heads, and torsos of various sizes. I asked him about his fascination, and he explained that he enjoyed creating unique dolls with lifelike features. One evening, while rummaging through the attic for extra bedding, I stumbled upon a box filled with photographs. Each picture featured a different tenant who had lived in my room before me. They all shared the same ghastly fate. Their body parts had been meticulously removed, and the remaining photos depicted grotesque dolls made from their flesh and bones. Each doll bore an eerie resemblance to its former occupant. The dates on the photos corresponded to the tenure of previous tenants, and a sickening realization washed over me. I had unwittingly moved into a house of horrors, where Victor turned his tenants into macabre art pieces, crafting his twisted dolls from their remains. Panicked, I confronted Victor, demanding an explanation. He admitted to his gruesome pastime without remorse, confessing that he considered it an art form. He claimed the dolls contained the essence of their former occupants, allowing him to commune with their spirits. As fear coursed through my veins, I knew I had to escape this house of nightmares. I devised a plan to flee under the guise of a weekend trip. While Victor believed me to be away, I called the authorities and reported his heinous crimes. The police arrived swiftly, arresting Victor and securing the evidence of his monstrous acts. The sight of his grisly creations and the horror of realizing I had lived among them haunted my nightmares for years. The trial that followed was a chilling spectacle, and Victor's sanity was questioned. He was declared criminally insane, consigned to a mental institution for the rest of his life. I thought my ordeal was over, but the nightmares continued to plague me. One fateful night, long after Victor had been confined, I awoke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. The room was pitch black, and I felt an icy breath on my neck. As I turned on the light, The dolls he had created stared back at me, their eyes filled with a sinister malevolence. Terrified, I realized that the essence of those who had suffered at Victor's hands still lingered within those wretched creations. They had returned to seek their vengeance on the one who had survived their torment. As the dolls closed in, their tiny, grotesque hands reaching out, I understood that I was to become their latest victim, the final piece of Victor's horrific collection. My desperate screams filled the room, but there was no one to hear them as darkness consumed me, and I became one with the damned. In the autumn of 2021, I was on the hunt for a new coffee table to complete my living room. I turned to Craigslist, hoping to snag a bargain, but I had no idea that this purchase would lead me into a chilling encounter with a man who would soon become my stalker. The Craigslist ad read, "Elegant coffee table, excellent condition, $100. Contact Leonard." The price seemed reasonable, and the photos showcased a beautiful mahogany coffee table that would be the perfect addition to my home. I promptly reached out to Leonard, and he responded within minutes. We agreed to meet at his place later that evening. As I navigated the winding streets to Leonard's home, I couldn't help but feel a growing unease. His address led me to a remote area on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist as I drove deeper into the forest. Leonard's house stood alone, a ramshackle structure in a clearing. Leonard emerged from the darkness to greet me, and a chill ran down my spine as I took in his disheveled appearance. He was tall and gaunt, with a wild, unkempt beard, and eyes that bore into me with an unsettling intensity. His grin seemed forced and never reached his eyes. Despite the dread gnawing at me, I followed Leonard into the house, my footsteps echoing in the dimly lit corridor. The room where the coffee table sat was even more unsettling. The table itself stood in the center, a relic from another era with an ornate design that seemed out of place in the decrepit surroundings. I cautiously inspected the table while Leonard prattled on about its supposed history and beauty. The moment my fingers touched the surface, an icy sensation spread through me, and I knew something was terribly wrong. But I couldn't let my unease show, so I handed over the cash and made a hasty retreat from the house. Once the table was in my apartment, the atmosphere in my living room grew oppressive. An unexplainable sense of dread hung in the air. As the days passed, I started receiving strange emails and messages from an anonymous sender, alluding to personal details of my life that no stranger should know. My unease deepened into paranoia as I realized I was being watched, and the coffee table seemed to be at the center of it all. Desperate to uncover the truth, I decided to look up public records to find anything about Leonard. What I discovered sent shivers down my spine. Leonard had a dark history of stalking, and there were police reports and restraining orders against him from multiple individuals. He had a pattern of luring victims through online transactions and then becoming obsessed with them. Terrified, I contacted the police and explained the situation. They immediately dispatched officers to my apartment to investigate. As the officers examined the coffee table, they found hidden cameras and recording equipment concealed within its ornate design. It became clear that Leonard had been watching my every move through the table, and he had access to personal information that should have remained private. The police launched a manhunt for Leonard, but he had vanished without a trace. In the wake of the investigation, I couldn't shake the feeling that Leonard was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to strike again. The coffee table, tainted by his malevolent presence, had become a haunting reminder of the terrifying encounter that had nearly cost me my privacy and my sanity. As I sit before the table now, I can't help but wonder if Leonard is still watching, biding his time, and plotting his return. The chilling realization that he might never truly be gone fills me with an unshakable sense of dread, and I am left to wonder if I will ever truly be free from the sinister presence of my stalker. Sorry if I don't write so well in English, but it's not my first language. I'm Italian, and my name's Luca. A long time ago, My twin brother Alfonso and I were 8 years old and played games on our father's computer. We were little. We liked monsters, horror movies, Halloween masks, anything that satisfied our creepy curiosity. In all these years, even now, although Alfonso and I are twins, we have never had any paranormal harmony. Indeed, everything was normal. At the time, we lived at our grandmother's house and we didn't have a room in common. I slept in the bed with my parents and he slept in the bed with my grandmother, in another room. It was a Saturday evening. We had seen something on the computer together and we went to sleep. We were a little late because we didn't go to school the next day, so we could easily sleep a little more. I lay in bed and I remember dreaming that I was lost in a park with monsters made of stone. One of the most disturbing was a statue of a monster with black eyes and an open mouth, with long hair and sharp teeth. The sky was grey, and I don't remember what else had happened. The next day I told my brother about the dream, and he himself interrupted me saying that he dreamed the same thing, a park of monsters made of stone and a scary monster with black eyes and a deep mouth. We got very scared and searched the internet. Wanna know the fucking creepy thing? The park we dreamed about was real, and so was that fucking monster. In fact, the park is called Park of Monsters, and is located in Bomarzo, right in Italy. The strange thing is that we have never seen that park. We have never been there also because it is very far from our house. But the really bad thing is that black-eyed, deep-mouthed monster actually exists. It is located inside the park and is called the Ogre. You can also see it on Google. It's too creepy. It was the only case of telepathy with my brother, dreaming in the same night of a place we've never been, we didn't know existed, both scared of a single monster that exists. This happened when I was growing up, around 2004 or 2005 when I was about 13 years old. It took place in a rural area, a good ways outside the town of Uvalde. The town itself was really small back then, and not much to look at. It's just one of those towns that really isn't on the way to anywhere important. My father knew someone who owned a deer lease that was about 1,000 acres, I think, down outside of that area, and was complaining about a ton of hogs that were tearing up their land. Being open season on hogs in the south, my dad thought he would surprise me that summer and take me down for a week to go hunting for them. Not only did that help him with networking for his job, but also gave us some quality father-son time. I remember the drive down there from Dallas was torture. It was about 7 hours in my dad's hardtop Jeep Wrangler. That car was so uncomfy, I hated it. All had to do was either stare out the window or try and beat Super Mario Land 2 on my Game Boy Pocket, something I was never able to accomplish in my youth. The drive, obviously, took most of the day, so we got there in the early evening. The owner of the land had told my dad that he hadn't had anyone lease it that year yet, and the cabin in the property might be a little rough and dusty. I didn't really care. At this point in my life, I had been in Scouts for a couple years, and spent a lot of my free time in the woods or fishing with friends. Needless to say, I was pretty comfortable roughing it. So after unlocking the gate and driving to the cabin on the land we settled in, the cabin was pretty rough, dust and dirt everywhere, flies. I remember that it looked like some raccoons had gotten into the cabin and crapped on the floor. After cleaning up a bit and getting the sleeping bags out, then setting up the cots, we decided to sleep. Something about that night was weird. I never was able to get comfortable enough to fall asleep for any restful amount. I couldn't put my finger on why, but I had that feeling of being watched. I was finally able to drift off for an hour maybe. When we woke up, it was early, about 7 a.m. We decided to scout around the land for tracks and signs of hogs and find a good place to set up a blind. It was the summer and horribly hot in the afternoon, so morning was the best time to be out and about. After walking for an hour or so, we came to an area of trees, lightly dense, and luckily found some signs of hogs. Typical torn-up ground where they had been rooting, so we followed them into the trees. I was looking for more signs when my dad stopped me with his arm. I remember looking up and seeing someone standing about 50 yards away. Some of their body was blocked by trees. This was private land, so they definitely weren't supposed to be there. We also had confirmation from the owner before we got to the lease that nobody was there, not to mention the gate was locked up when we first arrived. The person was wearing some bright-colored red jacket. We slowly walked toward them. My dad called out something like, "Hey, we're hunters. This is private land." The person didn't move at all. dead still. We were about 30 yards away, and could see that he was turned away from us with his hands in his pockets. Weird thing was that the person was in a ski jacket and what looked to be ski pants. Now this is Texas in the summer. It was about 98 outside by then. My dad called out again. No reaction. He told me to stay behind him and unsnapped the clip to his pistol holster. That's all we had at the time since we were only scouting the area. The rifles were back at the cabin. We approached the person's right side. I stayed and crouched down, watched him circle around to the frome of the man, all the while talking to him, asking if he was okay. He finally passed around to the frome of the man, and my dad stood straight up with a confused look on his face. I called out and said, "What's wrong?" And he called back, saying, "It's a mannequin." I walked over to it while my dad stood there staring, and as I got closer, one thing stood out the most. The clothes it was wearing were brand new. No dust, sap, bird droppings, or signs of being outside. At that moment, I looked at my dad and could see him get worried. Almost immediately after I felt that feeling again, like we were being watched, and I knew my dad felt it too. I wanted to start crying. I remember feeling suddenly so scared. My dad whispered, "We're leaving right now." He grabbed my hand and drew his pistol. He scanned the area the whole way back while I was trying to hold back panicked tears. We got back as fast as we could. I was terrified, so it felt like an eternity, but in reality was only about 45 minutes max. After returning, we packed up and beat feet. We drove back home that day and didn't talk much on the way back. I remember right after we left, my dad called his buddy, the owner of the land, and he was confused. He said that he would go check it out next week when he was in the area. He also said that he had never had an issue with people because his property was high-fenced. My dad normally isn't a paranoid person, but me being young and the lease possibly having someone there we didn't know about, he decided to be cautious and just get out of there. After we got back home, we talked, and my dad wasn't able to sleep the night before as well. He had the same feeling but didn't want to wake me up because he thought I was sleeping too. Turns out that next week he got a call from his buddy and he checked the whole property and never found any trace of anyone, no mannequin or anything. That story still makes my hair stand on end. No idea what that was, but the paranoid man in me thinks it was some kind of trap or something. Not the creepiest thing that happened to me in the woods, but Death Top 3. So whoever was out there, I'm glad we never met. My boyfriend at the time, now husband, let's call him H, was an avid outdoorsman and also served in the military. I was an ecology major and wanted to spend more time outdoors, so he decided to take me on my first backpack, just the two of us. For those who aren't familiar, the Grand Tetons are well known for their wildlife, specifically grizzly bears. My only experience with bears up to this point was watching a little black bear cross the road from the safety of my car. Seeing grizzly country signs around every corner wasn't doing much to calm my nerves. First incident, my boyfriend looked like Indiana Jones, machete hanging from his belt, large knives attached to each side of his pack, bear spray strapped to his waist. You get the picture. The beginning of our 25-mile journey was all uphill. When in bear country, you're supposed to make noise as to not startle the wildlife by accidentally sneaking up on it. As you can imagine, going up a steep hill while carrying a 40 lb pack makes it difficult to make conversation. We were an hour in, and almost at the top of the ascent. I noticed that the woods had gone completely silent, save for the rushing stream that was to our left of the trail. Silent woods are never a good sign. This usually indicates predators nearby. At this point, I was in front of my boyfriend, and we were about to crest the hill. For the past 20 minutes, we had not said a word to each other, having been too tired to speak. We noticed the silence at the same time and gave each other knowing glances. I came up over the top of the hill and immediately froze. Sitting not 10 feet in front of me in the middle of the trail was a grizzly bear. My husband wasn't aware yet, as he was behind me, so I did the first thing I could think of. While still in my frozen stance, I managed to take my arm and started flinging it wildly behind me, trying to get H's attention. I was too terrified to speak. The bear went from sitting to all fours, not looking away from us once. H quickly swung me around so that I was behind him, and he just started yelling. Being in the military, he knows how to yell. The grizzly wasn't quite fazed as it started to walk slowly towards us. At this point, I was on the verge of passing out from terror. This bear was about 5 feet in front of us when we heard a loud crack coming from the woods to our right. The bear heard it too, and he bolted towards the stream. A second crack boomed again, this time much closer than before. H said, "It's probably just some falling branches." But we both knew that wasn't the case. At this point, we were walking quickly up the trail in an attempt to create some distance from the grizzly and those strange noises. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up, and at that same moment H stopped moving in front of me. He turned around to look at me, and I turned to look behind me. To this day, we are not sure what we saw. Back where we were standing was a large black-brown mass. It looked to be 3 times bigger than the already large grizzly that we had seen just a few moments before. Its back was facing us, and then it stood on its back legs. It looked similar to a bear, but something about the shape was just off. At this point, it was probably stupid to run away, but that is exactly what we did. We were aware of heavy footsteps behind us, but neither of us looked back. The footsteps eventually faded. At this point, I was a mess. H was doing his best to console me. "Honey, this is extremely unusual. The bears usually stay away from humans. We're going to be okay. I'm sure that won't happen again." That was enough to convince me to continue on the backpack. Not another hour later, though, we reached a clearing where we decided to take a rest and eat a snack. About a minute after we had sat down, I noticed bushes moving in a line toward the clearing, toward us. Out of the brush comes this adolescent grizzly who looks just as spooked as I'm sure we did, but he came straight for us. H, being the crazy nut that he is, decided to charge back at the bear while screaming, "Bear spray at the ready." That did the trick, and the bear ran off. All I could think was, just my luck. But that wasn't even close to what happened the second night. Before we began our backpack, we had to let the ranger station know which trail's route we planned to take. With this information, they usually send a ranger on horseback at some point during the backpack to check on you to make sure everything is okay. There were not many approved trails left for us to choose from, and it was just our luck that they were the most difficult. Apparently over the 3 days we were on those trails, we had been the sole hikers. We didn't see a single other person once we were en route. Anyhow, I guess we missed the ranger who came to check on us. We had been following hoofprints the entire second day, and we hadn't seen any the day before. I had some foot problems, so we spent valuable daylight trying to adjust my boot laces, socks, to compensate for the pain. When we started on the trail again, we had maybe an hour or 2 of daylight left, and in the woods, it gets dark fast. I was exhausted. It was now dark out, and H was the only one with a working headlamp, as mine wouldn't even turn on for some reason. We needed to find somewhere to set up camp, as we still needed to eat. It was freezing, and the wind was blowing. It was creating a howling sound as it rushed through the trees, which made it difficult to hear H or discern any other sounds coming from the woods. After another hour of hiking through the dark, we found a clearing. Well, it was more like a bowl. It looked to be 200 meters in diameter, with the sides being 10 meters down. From the trail to the bottom of the clearing, this place was strange. We both felt it, though he didn't tell me how freaked he was till after we had left. There was no moonlight, so all we had was the illumination from his headlamp, our small camp stove, and the flashlight that I fished from my pack. Half of the trees were dead fallen, just in the bowl. The vegetation everywhere else was very dense. To help alleviate my anxiousness, he started playing music out of his portable speaker. This didn't help much, as it just echoed off the trees, creating a dissonance of sounds. He also thought it would ward off any predators nearby. This is when we knew our anxiousness wasn't paranoia. The silence was back. There hadn't been a single bird chirp since we arrived at the clearing. It also may have had to do with the obnoxious music, but because of our previous experience, we decided to turn off the music and head into the tent. Also, it was freezing. As soon as we were situated in our sleeping bags, we heard deep cracks and thuds echoing from beyond the tree line. Falling trees. There had been a lot of wildfires and very little rain this season. Thud. We both froze. That sound wasn't an echo, it came from inside the clearing. Definitely not a falling tree. Thudi. It came from right outside our tent. We both stopped breathing. Hitch's hand found mine and we clung to each other, paralyzed. Something dragged across the outside of our tent. making an indent as it went along. It was thin, almost like a finger. "What is it?" I whispered, shaking. "I don't know. Shouldn't be a person, we're the only ones on this side of the mountain." I was trying my hardest to stifle sobs, trying to listen to what was outside. I could hear steps, but couldn't decipher what it was. The steps stopped, and then the whole side of the tent was slowly pushed inwards. At this point, whatever was outside knew we were inside, so I shined my flashlight at the side of the tent. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was the shape of a human face pressed into the tent wall. I could make out the nose and an open mouth. Each time they breathed, it made the tent around their mouth billow in and out. H said, "Like that," and pulled a Glock from his sleeping bag. He cocked it, and the sound shattered the silence. The face pulled back, and we heard fast footsteps heading towards the edge of the clearing. We didn't leave the tent till the sun was shining the next morning. The first thing we noticed was the smell of urine. We came out of the tent and looked around. Whoever it was had peed on our coals we had left in the fire, leaving a disgusting stench of evaporated pee. Footprints surrounded our tent, circling around multiple times. Muddy handprints decorated the outside of our tent. We think it was mud anyway. The takeaway: wildlife is not the most dangerous thing in the backcountry. This story takes place in North Italy, back in 2014. It was early September. A friend of mine proposed me to make a short hike in the woods near his town, and I agreed, since I love hiking in the nature. We prepared our backpacks, grabbed some food, and drove to the place. My friend knew very well the area, so we didn't take a map. We didn't have flashlights neither or else, since we planned to return to the car in a few hours, and in early September, daylight lasts still pretty long. As we got deeper in the woods, we saw beautiful spots, small rivers, and a pair of caves we explored. They were pretty small and had only one big chamber. We had lunch and proceeded to follow a trail in a deeply wooded area. After around half an hour, we were at that point around 50 minutes away from the car, since we stopped so many times to snap photos or explore areas. We arrived to a pretty large clearance, and here comes the scary part. In that clearance there were a bunch of around 4 to 5 people, normally dressed. They were simply talking and laughing. No stanic cults, dreadful chants, praying in circle, or else. Just super ordinary people like me and my friend talking each other. They outsaw us too, since the clearance had no trees or rocks to cover the view, and we couldn't avoid that, since the trail, after a deep curve, immediately ends into the clearance, proceeding to the other side of it. We said, approaching them, since they were in the middle of the track, "Hey there, what's up?" They didn't answer back and started to stare at us, without saying a single word. This launched a huge red flag. We stopped too, and I've looked to my mate. He looked back at me concerned too. We said again, "Hey." No answers. I've started to feel uneasy, so we decided to return back to the car. But soon after C moved back, we realized that they started to follow us. As we noticed it, we yelled, "Why are you following us? Did we do something wrong?" We still were pretty young and dumb. In those kind of situations, and run immediately the fuck out of there if people act this way. No answer. Obviously, we proceeded to walk faster and tried to get out of the trail. Another pretty dumb choice, but again, my friend knew well the area. But they always were at around 15 meters of distance. We started to panic, so we looked again to each other and agreed to get out of there quickly. As soon as we begun running, we heard that they started to run too. This obviously made us freak out, and we made our best to put more distance between us and them. Another thing that made me panic was the fact that we were, as said, around 40 minutes away from the car, at that point in a very isolated area, so I thought that we were hopeless. At a certain point, when we were about half the way back, we started to notice that they weren't behind us anymore. We thought that maybe, and luckily, we managed to make them lose our track. The area, as said, is heavily wooded and has plenty of slopes, so that's easy to get lost if you are not used to it. Plus, we took an off-trail way that my friend knew. We hid behind a thick bush and tried to listen. Silence. Not footsteps, nor voices. And keep in mind that even when they were following us, they didn't say a single word. So, we took our breath and managed to return to car, trying our best to be as silent as possible. We jumped in the car and raced the hell out of there. but it doesn't end here. As we left the woods on the main road, we saw coming from a secondary road another car behind us. They were following us again, and they've surely never lose our tracks while we were returning to the car. We are sure that they were the same people, since 1, they were basically tailgating us. 2, the area is very rarely visited and there weren't absolutely 0 cars, except for my friend's 1, and 3, their car had no plates. We drove to my friend's town, avoiding to go to his house, taking every country road and every turn we made. They did as well. As we reached the town's ingress, they made a U-turn and returned back to the woods direction. We were fucking terrified, and we immediately called the police and informed the people that were in the small town square as they approached us, since me and my friend were basically crying as we got out of the car, to check that area out, but no evidence of activity came up in the following hours. They never ever showed up anymore in the following days, but we became paranoid for some weeks to even get out from our houses. And this is why I've took a break from hiking for about 4 years. I have no idea who they were and why they acted like this. So I was a wildland firefighter back in the day in Arizona. I worked in a forest that was generally popular with a lot of recreation in the northern portion, but I worked on the southern portion of the forest that was really remote. It barely had any roads or campgrounds, so if you wanted to recreate there, you had to work for it. The fire crew I was on had 2 duty stations, one in a small town where the rest of the forest employees worked out of, and one that was about 2.5 hours away, up a really windy, mountainous road. The remote duty station had an old Forest Service ranger station, and a newer double-wide trailer that was recently put in. When I worked at this place, it had no cell reception. When my crew and I weren't working, we were playing horseshoes and watching movies. They did eventually add a cell phone booster, which sadly made people play on their phones, but I digress. So for my creepy story, I want to keep it pretty simple. But my supervisor from that crew had experienced some weird things as well working up there. There was one night he told me he was cowboy camping, sleeping outside with no tent, and he kept getting a weird mucousy drop of liquid on his face. He kept looking around and even yelling, and no one was around him. He told me he wasn't below any trees. It wasn't tree sap. He never slept outside there ever again, which leads me to believe he was telling me the truth. Now for my story, I have had other interesting experiences at that remote duty station, but this one was scary. It was the night of July 4th, and we weren't on a fire, so the crew was playing horseshoes and having a good time. Everyone went to bed pretty early because we were going to have a PT hike the next day. I had my own small room in the double-wide trailer, and my bed was situated next to a big window. I started dozing off but felt awake still, and I hear one of my co-workers outside my window asking me to come outside. I was laying on my side facing the window, and I didn't look up, but I felt their pretense by the window. It felt as though something tall was looming over me from outside. They kept beckoning me and I said no. Pretty quickly their voice started changing to a deeper, raspier, angrier voice. They started cursing at me, "Get the fuck outside!" I just froze. It was sort of a demonic voice. I lay frozen, not moving, while they yelled at me. Eventually it stopped and I fell asleep. I woke up the next day and wanted to ask my coworker if he was standing outside my window, but I felt too weird. Perhaps this was a mild form of sleep paralysis, but still very weird. I could give you 1,000,000 times as a kid and young adult I felt scared or paranoid playing in the woods. It's a beautiful place, and I spent my entire childhood getting lost, not literally, out there by myself or with friends. As kids, we never got too far out there, but you could actually see the progression of us venturing further and further out as we got older, because of forts and carvings we would leave. This one particular time, like 1,000 times before, my friend and I had just graduated high school. It was our last summer of freedom, and we spent the entire summer camping and hiking out there. We had decided to try and find a new place to set up camp, and walked for what felt like a few miles before we came to a nice clearing. The area was relatively new to both of us. We got the camp set up and fire going, and the plan was to wait until nightfall, smoke some weed, and play Monopoly. For sake of backstory on my friend and I, my buddy is a smaller, real goofy guy, but comes from a family of foresters and always had a deep understanding of all the trees and different plants you came across. He had no fear of going and camping out by himself. If I spent 10,000 hours in the woods, he probably spent 50,000. As for me, I'm a taller, sturdier guy, and as we got older, I spent more time worried about women and sports, and the woods became a place for small parties. Also, I never had the balls to camp out alone. In fact, older me wouldn't go far at all when I was alone because I could never shake the feeling of being watched, which was just paranoia, but still an uneasy feeling. Anyways, camp is set, fire is going, but it's getting lower and needs wood. Sun is down, and we're both cutting up and having a good time. My friend is sitting on this little chair he always brought and loading up this makeshift bong, and I was crouched breaking some excess limbs off some of the logs we had gathered for the fire. All of a sudden, this strong breeze cuts through the clearing. I couldn't tell you if it was the suddenness of it or what, but my friend and I both stopped immediately and looked at each other. The breeze went just long enough to flicker our fire down to a small flame. We both sat completely still, in almost total darkness. Neither of us said a word. Across from us on the other side of the fire, we could hear footsteps. They sounded like somebody was running and would slow to a walk and then run again, definitely on two legs. By the sound of it, they were pacing back and forth over the same spot. Then, just like it started, it stopped with a softer crunch on the underbrush. I knew by the sound it had taken a crouch. I was crouched still and knew I was staring right at it in the dark. My friend grabbed my shoulder and said, "Buddy," and when he did, I felt this surge of fear come over me. I could feel it and hear it in him. I had been so fixed on the footsteps and rationalizing what I heard that I hadn't even considered being afraid. But this was true fear. It was raw and made me feel helpless. I could hear my friend after a while grab some leaves and he dropped them on the fire. For the split second the leaves covered the fire, we were in pure darkness. And the fire sprang to life. We both quickly grabbed more leaves and brush and threw it on the fire. I got some sticks and logs on there and neither of us took our eyes off the spot or moved much. Finally the leaves crunched and it slowly walked off. Whatever it was had sat crouched watching us without moving for far longer than any animal would. It wasn't until after the footsteps disappeared that I realized the smell had disappeared as well. It smelled like a paper mill. Spoiled eggs almost. For the rest of the night, besides whispered remarks, neither of us really moved or stopped looking at the spot. Nobody went into the tent, and I had very short light sleep sitting on the ground with my head rested on my hands. My friend never went to sleep. In the morning we packed up and silently walked back home. To this day we talk about it. In the 7 years since it happens, my forester friend has not camped by himself out there since. This was the most terrifying moment of my life. Always will be. My family and a family friend's family were going on a hiking trip to the Appalachian Mountains. We had rented cabins at a camping site and had arranged certain paths to follow each day of our trip, 4 days long, that we would walk each day. The first 3 days went great. We saw wildlife, had a good time and talked a lot. But on the 4th day, we were taking a trail that was more secluded and overgrown than the others. We were walking for about 30 minutes when I was hit with this overwhelming feeling of uneasiness. The feeling just stayed there no matter how hard I tried to beat it back. Then, and everyone else on the hike denies this, I hear singing, in a language that I've never heard before. It's like the singing described in the myth of the sirens, sweet and enchanting. Yet the music invoked a feeling of fear, down to my bones. Everyone else seems completely oblivious to it. I tried telling my dad that something was wrong, but he just told me I was probably tired and that we would stop soon. So, about 5 minutes later, and the singing just keeps getting louder, and my heart was racing. We had stopped to rest, and eat something as well. I wish with all my heart that we hadn't stopped. About 2 minutes into our little rest, the singing is still getting progressively loud, but my nerves have settled slightly. Then, everything falls silent. Everyone in our group, about 12 people, suddenly turns to the trees to our left. A figure, tall, and in a black cloak, was barely visible between the trees. It was a woman, much taller than normal people are, with pure white hair flowing out of her hood. Her head is down, but her face is still slightly visible. All I can make out is that her skin is very pale yellow, like old paper. As we watch, she just stalks closer to our group, finally stopping right at the edge of the trees. She looks up, and I swear to God, as long as I live and breathe, I will never forget her face. Her eyes are completely white, with no pupils or irises visible. She had a thin, pointed nose and had a mouth with lips that were stained red. I don't want to know why. She stares at us for a moment and then smiles. It was horrifying. She had no teeth and her eyes began to shine. She then begins to talk. She had a horrible, scratchy, high-pitched voice and said, "Leave this place while you still can. I'll be watching you, don't try anything." I blink, and she's gone. Everyone is silent. This is my first time telling the story to anyone else who didn't experience this with me, and I never discuss it with anyone who did experience this with me.
Driving along Dead Man's Curve at night always sent shivers down my spine. The road's twisted path was infamous for the accidents and tragedies that had occurred there over the years. Legends whispered of vengeful spirits lingering in the shadows, and that night, I was about to discover the terrifying truth. As I navigated the sharp turns, the headlights of my car illuminated the dark, winding road ahead. The air grew colder, and an oppressive silence descended. Suddenly, the engine sputtered and died, leaving me stranded in the inky blackness. Panic set in as I tried to restart the car, but it remained lifeless. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. Staring out into the inky abyss, I noticed movement in the shadows. Faint, ghostly figures flickering at the edge of the headlight's reach. My heart raced as the figures drew nearer. They were indistinct, but I could make out tattered clothing and pallid, gaunt faces. Their eyes held an empty, mournful stare, and a chorus of whispers filled the air like a distant lament. Terrified, I stepped out of the car and stumbled backward. The figures surrounded me, their voices growing louder, their breaths chilling as they brushed against my skin. I recognized the pain and despair in their eyes. They were the souls of those who had met their end on Dead Man's Curve. One figure, more defined than the others, approached. His hollow eyes bore into mine, and his voice, though weak, was filled with accusation. "You should not have come here," he rasped. The other spirits closed in, their ghostly hands reaching out as if to pull me into their tragic realm. I backed away, terror gripping me, and ran toward the curve, desperate to escape their grasp. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape the relentless pursuit of the vengeful spirits. They whispered stories of their deaths, of reckless drivers and terrible accidents, their words echoing in my mind. As I reached the final bend of Dead Man's Curve, the spirits closed in, their mournful cries growing deafening. In a blinding flash, I was overcome by darkness. I awoke with a start, sitting behind the wheel of my car. The engine roared to life, and the headlights illuminated the empty road ahead. But the memory of the haunting encounter with the vengeful spirits of Dead Man's Curve would forever haunt my nightmares. I had ventured into a realm where the past and the present collided, where the echoes of tragedy would forever reverberate through the twisted road, and where the spirits of the forgotten dead would forever seek retribution from those who dared to trespass. The legend of Dead Man's Curve had always intrigued me. It was said to be haunted by a faceless hitchhiker who roamed the area late at night, appearing between 1:20 and 1:40 a.m. One evening, driven by both curiosity and disbelief, I decided to test the legend for myself. As the clock in my car's dashboard ticked past 1:20 a.m., I felt a chill creep up my spine. The darkness seemed to grow thicker with every mile. I had almost convinced myself that the legend was nothing more than a ghost story, but doubt still lingered in my mind. That's when I saw him, a figure standing at the side of the road, bathed in the faint glow of my headlights. My heart skipped a beat as I approached. The hitchhiker was dressed in tattered clothes, his face obscured by a hood and shadow. A sense of unease washed over me, but I couldn't resist the urge to test the legend. I slowed down and rolled down the window. "Need a lift?" I asked hesitantly. The hitchhiker didn't respond, but his hooded head turned slightly in my direction. It was impossible to see his face, and a shiver ran down my spine. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the passenger door, and he climbed in without a word. The car grew uncomfortably silent as I continued to drive along the winding road. I could feel his presence beside me, his energy heavy and foreboding. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. "Where are you headed?" I finally mustered the courage to ask. Still, he remained silent, his face hidden in the shadows of the hood. Panic began to rise within me as I realized that I had willingly picked up a stranger in the dead of night, on a haunted road no less. Just as I was about to demand an answer, the car suddenly lurched forward, the brakes screeching as if I had hit something. My heart raced as I brought the car to a halt, my headlights revealing an empty road ahead. I turned to the passenger seat, but the hitchhiker was gone. The back door hung open as a chilling wind swept through the car. The sense of unease turned to dread, and I knew I needed to leave Dead Man's Curve immediately. As I sped away from the haunted road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The legend had become a terrifying reality, and I had become entangled in its eerie web. Weeks passed, and I tried to put the nightmarish encounter behind me. But each night as I lay in bed, I felt a presence lurking just beyond my sight. Whispers echoed through my mind, a voiceless plea for something I couldn't comprehend. Then, one fateful night, I woke to find myself standing at the edge of Dead Man's Curve. The hooded hitchhiker stood before me, his presence suffocating. In a voiceless chorus, the spirits of those who had hit him on this cursed road joined him. As the clock struck 1:40 a.m., the faceless hitchhiker reached out, his hood falling back to reveal a featureless void where a face should be. In that moment, I understood the legend. The hitchhiker was a guardian of the road, seeking retribution for those who had wronged him. I couldn't escape. The legend had become my reality, and as the headlights of an approaching car grew blindingly bright, I realized that I had become another unwitting victim of Dead Man's Curve, forever trapped in a never-ending cycle of haunting. The flickering fluorescent lights barely illuminated the grimy hallway, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance at the corners of my vision. I had ventured into the infamous backrooms, a labyrinthine maze said to exist beyond reality, and now I was hopelessly lost. My heart raced as I retraced my steps, the disorienting hallways all seeming identical. The persistent hum of the lights added to my growing anxiety. Panic gnawed at the edges of my mind, but I couldn't let it consume me. The stories I had heard about the backrooms were enough to chill anyone's soul. Tales of those who had disappeared within these endless corridors, never to be seen again. As I turned another corner, my heart sank. I heard the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the sterile, lifeless air. Someone or something was following me. I quickened my pace, hoping to evade whatever lurked in the shadows. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and I could now hear an unnerving, wheezing breath accompanying them. I desperately searched for an exit, a way out of this maddening place, but the hallway stretched on infinitely. My only choice was to hide. Ducking into an adjacent room, I pressed my back against the cold, damp wall, my labored breaths echoing in my ears. The footsteps drew nearer, and my heart pounded like a drum. The wheezing grew louder, right outside the door. A chilling realization washed over me. Whatever was out there knew I was in here. The handle of the door began to turn slowly, and I held my breath, praying it wouldn't open. But it did. The door creaked open, revealing a figure shrouded in darkness. Its eyes gleamed with a malevolent, unnatural light. My voice caught in my throat as the thing stepped into the room, its wheezing breath growing louder, almost deafening. It moved toward me, its grotesque form becoming more distinct. Its skin was pallid and mottled, its limbs unnaturally long and contorted. But it was its face that terrified me the most. A grotesque mask of twisted features, devoid of eyes, nose, or mouth, just a gaping void. As it drew closer, it reached out with skeletal fingers, inches away from touching me. I could feel the dread and despair emanating from it, a suffocating presence that threatened to consume me. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and retreated into the hallway, the door swinging shut behind it. I remained hidden, unable to move or comprehend what had just occurred. When I finally gathered the courage to leave the room, I found myself standing in a familiar hallway. It seemed different now, as if it had never been a part of the haunting back rooms. I hurried toward the exit, fleeing the endless corridors and the nightmarish encounter that would forever haunt my nightmares. I had survived the back rooms, but I knew I would never truly escape the feeling of being watched, followed by something that should never exist in any realm of reality.
I ventured deeper into the wilderness, my heart pounding with each step. A sense of dread hung in the air, as if the very woods were warning me to turn back. I had come in search of something, a story to make my name as a fearless explorer. The legend spoke of the Wendigo, a malevolent spirit that dwelled in these woods, hungry for human flesh. I scoffed at the idea, dismissing it as mere superstition. As night descended, I set up camp by a small, ice-cold stream. The whispering pines seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I lit a feeble fire, its flickering light doing little to chase away the encroaching darkness. That's when I heard it, a faint, mournful wail carried on the wind. I brushed it off as a trick of my imagination, but the cry persisted, growing louder and more desperate. Fear crawled up my spine as I realized the chilling truth. It was the cry of the Wendigo. I retreated into my tent, praying for safety as the wails drew nearer. The forest seemed to come alive with eerie whispers and rustling leaves, and I knew I was not alone. Shadows danced on the tent walls, their grotesque forms haunting my every thought. Hours passed, and I lay paralyzed in terror, listening to the unnatural sounds that filled the night. It was as if the very forest itself had turned against me. The Wendigo's cries grew louder, more agonized, as if it reveled in my fear. Suddenly, the tent was ripped open, and I found myself face to face with the embodiment of my nightmares. The Wendigo was a grotesque monstrosity, its emaciated body covered in tattered, frost-covered rags. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent hunger, and its gnarled hands reached out for me. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, and fled into the darkness of the forest. Branches clawed at my flesh, and I could hear the Wendigo's footsteps closing in, its chilling laughter echoing through the night. I ran until my strength gave out, collapsing by the stream where I had made camp. The Wendigo's wails faded into the distance, but I knew it was not defeated. It had merely released me, a warning to all who dared enter its domain. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I crawled back to civilization, forever haunted by the encounter with the Wendigo. The forest had whispered its chilling secrets, and I had listened. But some stories are better left untold, and some creatures are best left undisturbed in the depths of the wilderness, where they can whisper their malevolent tales to the brave and the foolish who dare to listen. I was on a hunting trip with a few friends, seeking the thrill of tracking game in the heart of the wilderness. As we moved deeper into the forest, a sense of unease settled over me. The woods were unusually silent, devoid of the usual rustling and calls of wildlife. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for something unknown to pass. But my companions seemed unfazed, their laughter echoing through the stillness. It wasn't long before we stumbled upon a set of tracks, large, deep imprints in the snow that sent a shiver down my spine. They were unlike anything I had seen before, with elongated claw marks extending from the heels. My friends exchanged excited glances, their anticipation growing as they followed the tracks with eager determination. I hesitated for a moment, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, but curiosity and peer pressure pushed me forward. We followed the tracks for what felt like hours, the moon casting eerie shadows among the trees. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying with it a mournful sound that sent a chill down my spine. As we continued deeper into the woods, the tracks became more sporadic, as if whatever had left them was moving with purpose, zigzagging through the underbrush. My unease grew with each step, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I raised my flashlight, scanning the darkness around us, but the beam only revealed the haunting beauty of the snow-covered landscape. "We should turn back," I finally spoke up, my voice trembling despite my attempts to sound steady. My friends exchanged skeptical looks, their enthusiasm waning only slightly. "Come on, don't be such a wimp," one of them teased. Reluctantly, I pressed on, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. We soon reached a small clearing, the moonlight illuminating a scene that froze my blood. In the center of the clearing stood a deer carcass, its body torn open in a gruesome display. The tracks circled the carcass, as if whatever had feasted on it had danced around the remains. The stench of death hung heavy in the air, mingling with the cold. I felt bile rise in my throat, the horror of the scene before me rendering me momentarily speechless. My friends exchanged shocked glances, their bravado replaced by a shared sense of dread. "What kind of animal could do this?" one of them whispered. I wanted to retreat, to put as much distance between myself and the clearing as possible, but a fascination, a morbid curiosity, rooted me in place. As I studied the tracks again, I realized that they were heading deeper into the woods, away from the carnage. Without a word, my friends and I continued following the tracks, the fear that gripped me now mixed with a strange anticipation. The woods seemed to close in around us, the trees becoming more twisted and gnarled as if they were reaching out to ensnare us. And then, we heard it. A sound that froze our blood and turned our veins to ice. It was a guttural, inhuman growl, a sound that reverberated through the night like a warning. We shone our flashlights around, but the darkness seemed to stretch infinitely in every direction. Panic surged within me, and I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs refused to obey. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form gaunt and skeletal, its eyes gleaming with a feral hunger. It was tall and emaciated, its skin stretched tightly over its bones, and its limbs seemed impossibly elongated. It was a creature of nightmares, a creature that should not exist in the realm of the living. Wendigo, the word slipped from my lips, barely audible even to myself. The creature's lips peeled back in a grotesque grin, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. It stepped forward, its movements disjointed and unnatural, as if it had forgotten how to walk like a human. The wind howled around us, carrying with it the anguished whispers of those who had encountered this malevolent entity before. My friends and I backed away slowly, our flashlights trembling in our hands. We were trapped in the presence of a Wendigo, a creature born of desperation and the darkest corners of human nature. Its hunger was insatiable, its existence a curse that defied the laws of life and death. And then, the Wendigo lunged, its movement so swift and fluid that it was upon us before we could react. I screamed, the sound torn from my throat as its claws raked across my chest. Pain shot through me and I stumbled backward, my flashlight falling from my grasp. As my friends scattered, the forest seemed to warp and twist around me, the Wendigo's piercing laughter echoing in my ears. I stumbled through the underbrush, my breath ragged and my vision blurred. The night seemed to stretch on forever, a never-ending nightmare of darkness and fear. Eventually I collapsed, my body giving in to exhaustion and pain. The forest seemed to close in around me, its shadows merging with my own. The Wendigo's whispers filled my mind, promising an eternity of suffering and hunger. And as the cold claimed me, I realized that in the heart of the woods there are terrors that defy explanation.